Hello and welcome to Dialogue. 7 decades ago, then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai put forth the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence for the first time, which are mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Over the past 70 years, these principles have been widely accepted and recognized as instrumental to maintaining world peace and have become the cornerstone of China's foreign policy. What is at the core of the 5 principles? Why are they still relevant in terms of addressing current global crises and challenges? And what do these principles mean for a more just and balanced international political and economic order? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor at Soochow University, Radhika Desai, Professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Yan Oberg, Director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, and John Palm, the independent political analyst. Welcome to the show. Victor, I will start with you. For those who are not familiar with these 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, what is the core message from the 5 principles here?
Well, we are celebrating the 70th year anniversary of the pronouncement of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which have always been the cornerstone of China's foreign policy, and encouragingly, it has been generally accepted by the international community as the guiding principle for maintaining peace and stability and mutual development in the world. I think at the very core of the 5 principles is mutual respect of each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-use of war, for example, in dealing with each other's relations, equality and mutual benefit, for example. All these elements are important for a peaceful and stable international order. It applies not only to bilateral relations, like, for example, in 1954 between China and India, but also applies to all the other bilateral relations and regional relations or international relations as a whole. So I think it's encouraging to see that these 5 principles have not only survived the past 7 decades, but it's becoming more and more relevant because the world today is at the crossroad of whether we will choose peace or war, and if we choose peace, how to structure and maintain the bilateral relations of each countries in the world.
So Radhika, of course, it's 70 years. Tell us more about this background. Against what kind of situation, what kind of development that China proposed such ideas, and then it was obviously jointly mentioned or embraced by India, Myanmar, and other developing countries?
Well, the background is very important. It's very critical, and the background is the end of the Second World War, the defeat of fascism, the discrediting of imperialism. I think that is very critical. And the newfound independence of many formerly colonial and semi-colonial countries, and including, of course, the Chinese Revolution. And in this context, countries like China, India, and others, they were basically demanding that they should be treated with as much respect as all countries have ever treated one another. Some people would say that the demand for the extension of Westphalia principles to include the formerly colonized world. And I think sometimes we forget just how vulnerable this formerly colonized world was. There were still wars being waged. China was not recognized, of course. Wars were being waged in Korea, in Vietnam, and many other places, including places in Africa and so on. So there was a great deal of vulnerability, and therefore China's leadership in enumerating these principles was a way of saying that now that the West has discredited itself, imperialism is no longer viable. The West nearly tore apart the whole world by fighting this world war, and the West cold not have won this world war without the help of the Soviet Union and China. And as a consequence, I think, and of course, many soldiers from places of India, Africa, and so on. So I think the Third World was essentially saying, we are in, and you must treat us with respect. And they were also saying that we don't want your imperialism, we want a different way of dealing with one another. And that was embodied in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Respect and equality. Yan, you were at the present for today's event marking this 70th anniversary, in which President Xi Jinping delivered a very important speech. Tell us, your impression of the event. What were you thinking when you listened to the speech?
I thought, first of all, that it was very interesting that the perspective of the president is macro in time and space, in contrast to the West. Secondly, it's spoken from the point of view of a global we, rather than a we and them thinking. And third, you might find it incredible if I say it, but this is a place where it's legitimate to talk about peace and discuss what peace is, etc., which I can tell as a person living in Sweden and a scholar with some experience as a peace researcher, it's almost taboo now in the Western world to talk about peace as an alternative way of solving problems. Conflict resolution by civilian means, etc. The agenda now is warfare or military, and even not diplomacy anymore. The problem I see with it is that however good these principles are, and they would be preventive of war if all countries adhered to them, but there are countries that do not adhere to these principles, is what do we do with those principles, with those who are not interested in? And that's where you are coming to the United Nations Charter, which I'm very happy that your president emphasized every time, and China in its foreign policy have emphasized all the time. But there we should remember that Article 1 says that peace shall be established by peaceful means. And I know basically no countries except perhaps Costa Rica and Iceland who don't have any military who adhere to this principle. In large or smaller terms, you can say all countries are violating that Article 1 of the UN Charter. So I think what we're finally coming to is we live in a world in which we spend 300 to 400 times more on the military than on the United Nations. This is a perverse priority of global society. And unless we address, and nobody addressed it really today, the question of militarism, military-based security that never leads to peace, etc., I don't think we're getting very far with the principles. The principles have to be filled with concrete measures for common security, human security, global governance, and defensive defense, military and civilian. We cannot keep on having offensive defense and threatening each other 7,000 kilometers away and then say we are peaceful. And we cannot in the long run have nuclear weapons because they are offensive weapons. I know no country and no people who would like nuclear weapons to be used in defense on their own territory. They are by definition offensive and therefore do not belong to the 5 principles. And by the way, finally, we have a treaty for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So there's a long way to go, but the principles are brilliant.
Yeah, the principles are brilliant. These principles were first mentioned 70 years ago. John, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in the speech, he said the purpose of the event is to carry forward these principles under the new circumstances of today, and building together a community with a shared future for mankind. The ultimate goal, that is the community. The path toward that is, I guess, 5 principles. But also here, the new circumstances. How do you characterize today's world? What are the new circumstances here?
Thank you. I think Professor Desai's very neat summary of the context of these principles is very, very important. They are important because we are once again in a similar situation. These were articulated in the wake of the Second World War, and as these national movements of independence were coming about, finding themselves, and as a Cold War loomed, we are once again in this sort of interregnum between the the end of an old order and a new. And I think if we step back, the big picture is that this President Xi Jinping's speech today and the celebration of these principles is a marvelous assertion of the importance of these and the relevance of these principles once again to our time right now. It's very important that these principles were articulated against imperialism, in an anti-imperialist and counter-hegemonic spirit. This is once again something important. So it answers the biggest question of our time. At the end of the unipolar order, at the end of a however you want to describe it, whether you go back and you see the end of 500 years of Western domination, or the end of that period of extraordinary U.S. supremacism after the end of the Cold War, something is coming to an end here. And the big question is, what is this multipolar? People are talking about a kind of multipolar order as the next thing. What are the principles that are going to govern it? What is it going to look like? And these principles are offered as relevant once again, but in the context of now in their reformulation as within this project, this initiative that I suppose that President Xi invites the rest of the world to, of a community of a shared future for humanity. So the breakup, the fragmentation of the world, if you will, is not a kind of fragmentation into war in this vision, but the space allowed for diversity of civilizations, diversity of socio-economic paths, right, of the size of countries. So it's in that light that these 5 principles are relevant once again. And I hope we have time to go in and discuss exactly how that is the case.
Furthering what John has said, Victor, obviously these 5 principles are probably becoming more relevant into this world filled with crises and challenges.
Indeed. As we speak, we have a war in Ukraine, we have a war in Gaza. There are similarities of potential conflicts involving Lebanon, between Lebanon and Israel, for example, and you have conflict areas in different parts of the world. And this is time for mankind to reflect as to what is the right path going forward. And as demonstrated by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, only by respecting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, not using war as an instrument of the state, for example, respecting each other and promoting joint development, common good, for example, can we really achieve a world of peace? And peace for all, not just peace for the mighty, for example. And we should say a final goodbye to those political maneuvers which would use force, brutal force, war, for example, to gain the upper hand against other people. Countries need to be equal, and we should deal with each other on an equal basis. And this world that we are living in is a multipolar world. It's not a world dominated by one single power, believing that it's subjugating all the rest of the world to its willpower, for example. And I think this is not only a philosophical theory, but also a roadmap for pragmatism. Whether all countries will sign up with these 5 principles or not, it's uncertain. There are still countries which want to use brutal force to get away in dealing with other countries. We want to say no to these countries, and we want to instill sanity and reason and rationality to all countries so that they will say a final goodbye to war and they will embrace peace, which is important for all of us.
Yeah. Similarly, peace for all, and then there's another issue like security. When it comes to security, some countries often stress their own security, economic security, of course. In terms of defense, in terms of high tech, everything now is about security. Of course, there's abuse of the concept, and also, it's about the unilateral kind of my security, often at the expense of your security. under such principles, in the 5 principles of a peaceful coexistence, how should we approach this security issue? I mean, every country probably is necessary.
Well, imagine that instead of national security, you think of human security and global security, that you have a multi-level, not only a multipolar, but a multi-level security consideration. Because the world is no longer that relevant in terms of 100 or 200 nation states. There are other mechanisms now. The nation state or the countries are getting less important, and regions and human beings and the global governance is getting more important. Now, the problem you mentioned is kind of the philosophical dilemma of humanity, actually, because my security has been practiced so far in a way that harms your security. And that's why I say, if people believe in deterrence, that's fine with me. I think it's a bad concept psychologically. But if they believe in deterrence as a way to keep peace, it should be defensive deterrence. I mean, to put it crudely, sitting here in Beijing, I would say that's the wall that China built once. It doesn't threaten anybody, but it's a hard thing to get through if somebody attacks you, right? And with modern technology and short-range weapons and all that, we could shape a military and civilian conflict resolution system in a way that would permit us to do our security without threatening offensively. I get rid of everything offensive. That would be my slogan. Get rid of everything offensive. And that means long-range weapons. It means weapons with super high destruction capacity. And it means get rid of weapons of mass destruction. And let's discuss the right priority, which is always, and according to the UN and common sense, is to talk first with each other, exhaust all possibilities, which is embedded in the UN Charter, that everything must have been tried first and found in vain before the UN can organize a military operation. You can say this is outdated thinking. No, it's not. In a globalized world, this is visionary in the sense that we have to have a global organization that can go through the steps of conflict handling, conflict mitigation, mediation, finding solutions. I mean, a conflict is nothing but a problem that needs to be solved. And violence comes because the parties don't know how to solve it. And the simple thing, if you put this together, is to say we need an organization where we follow certain rules of the game, and violence must always be the last resort, because there will always be conflicts in any human system, whether factories or families or children, parents or whatever, or the global system. What we must reduce to survive is violence, all kinds of violence, direct violence, structural violence, violence against nature. It's a violence reduction project the humanity is standing in front of and do not really seem to work with. And therefore I said it's a good beginning with the principles, but they don't solve the problems.
No, but it's a good beginning. Okay, it's really about the concept, the ideas like we agree upon. So Radhika, of course, security, you can talk about it, one's own security, and also you can talk about inclusive security, like pay attention to your own security while taking into consideration for the security of others. Because along with security, I think China also put forward the idea of like a global civilization initiative. Acknowledging the differences of different countries, with different religions, sometimes in different background, different traditions. But it's really about how do we deal with each other, how we conduct our relationship, and then to avoid the conflict probably in the first place.
Well, I think, I just want to address this issue of conflict and the relevance of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence today by going back to something that John was saying. We are really living at a historic moment when a large part of the turbulence in the world that President Xi and others have referred to, that we can all see, is actually is emerging from dying gasps of the imperial order. I think it's very important, it's very good, and it's very important to underline that we all ought to talk together as one world. But you see, we can't have one world so long as one part of the world insists on dominating, exploiting, destroying, expropriating, and plundering another part of the world. And that latter part of the world has, over the last century and more, woken up and has insisted that it is not going to be trampled upon in the old ways. And so and the principles of peaceful coexistence is one of the major contributions of that part of the world, and the major proposals to say that, in a world in which we can all thrive together needs to be founded on these principles. And what does the West do today? In opposition, instead of accepting the principles of peaceful coexistence, it comes up with ideas like the rules-based international order.
Absolutely.
In which there are no rules, they make them up as they go along, and they are simply used to foment war. President Xi and China and all the delegates who are there today at the ceremony and at the event were talking about peace, whereas all the West is doing these days is talking about war. More weapons for Ukraine, more weapons for Israel, more weapons for more military bases around China. You name it, they are doing these things, and the reason is very, very simple. Imperialism has always meant the refusal on the part of the West to acknowledge that other countries may have their own developmental priorities. Imperialism is the denial of development, and I think it is not a coincidence that as part of these slew of initiatives that China has proposed, the Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, is also the Global Development Initiative. That is what all these countries are seeking. Development is something that can be achieved peacefully, but imperialism is not.
Well, John, following Radhika's remarks here, let's develop the world, or the Western world, when it comes to the idea of 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, that's not something they welcome or they are ready to embrace. Obviously, we are seeing, as Radhika has talked about, even when it comes to relationship with China, for example, Washington proposed practiced idea of like small yard, high fence, or decoupling from the China side to the supply chain, for example, or even senior officials talked publicly about slowing down the Chinese growth. What do you make of this, and what will such a stance, such policies lead to?
We have an extraordinary set of oppositions here. You mentioned, for example, the small garden and high fence approach of the U.S. This is a self-described policy. In opposition to this is, one might say, a huge garden with no fences type of vision laid out. In opposition to an imagination of a conception of world order which pits democracies on the one hand versus autocracies on the other, in essentially a dualistic worldview that is a recipe for permanent war. A war that ends only in the victory of one side. This is a war to end all wars. In opposition to that, you have this extraordinary articulation of a vision of peace, where the rest of the world can have its own path. Each country finds its own way within its cultural, its socio-economic, its religious circumstances, what have you, right? With each aiding the other within a single globalized world. That is, it preserves both the diversity and the unity instead of setting one against the other. There's an Indonesian saying, something very important in Indonesian thinking, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. It means unity in diversity. Out of fragmentation, one. Now, this principle actually comes out of this tradition. It's completely articulated within these 5 principles, which are embedded in the Chinese constitution, but also later on, but taken up in the Bandung Conference, and then later by the non-aligned movements. These principles are rooted also in Indian foreign policy, for example. they are at the basis of how ASEAN operates. So for anyone who thinks these are just sort of, vague sort of principles and they don't set the rules, a sort of European mindset might want to ask, well, what happens, where are the mechanisms for solving issues? Let me say that these are very, very substantial. These are principles of world order. They were set out at a time when there was a huge contestation over world order, and the non-aligned nations, at some 1.77 of them, stood aside and said, no, we're not going to be part of this. Well, now is the moment for actually the rest of the world. This is the moment for this conception of order, and it is emerging, right? So that set of oppositions, one with development. Have you ever heard, in Western notions, when people talk about rules-based order, whoever talks about development, whoever talks about eradication of poverty, the violence of poverty, none of that. It means nothing to most of the world. But this is something the rest of the world can get together. And as I said, it preserves that unity. There's a great concern now as the world fragments, or you have a multipolar world. And a Western imagination would have it, well, if you're going to be fragmented, then, it's just going to be anarchy and war. No, not in this vision. Out of a Chinese view, but also a very Asian ontology, cosmology, if you will.
Right. Well, we're very close to that. Victor, John is basically talking about, the global South. And in the speech, President Xi Jinping also paid attention to the global South and talked about, how to basically provide more support to the development of the global South. And, we talked about the rise of the global South. For example, here China will import goods and services worth of $8 trillion from now to 2030 from the developing world. And also China is, to set up a study center for the global South and provide 1,000 scholarships and then 100,000 training opportunities for people from the global South. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, I think from the Chinese perspective, growth and development should be inclusive rather than exclusive. And those countries which, for whatever reason, enjoying a relative greater amount of development should have greater responsibility to share their growth results with the rest of the world. And I think China's doing according to this principle of sharing its expertise, wealth, and experiences with the rest of the world, especially among the global South or the developing countries. I think this is the right thing. And also, I think mankind need to be constantly reminded that we, as a Homo sapien, really have a choice. Either we go in the direction of peace or we go in the direction of war. War eventually will be disastrous and destructive, especially in the nuclear age. And peace is the only right way forward, not only for China or some members of the global South, but for all the countries, including the developed world. Because if there are war breaking out in different parts of the world, no one will be saved. And only peace, as I mentioned, will save mankind, not only for today, but for future.
Following on that, Victor, just 1 minute less, less than 1 minute, Xi Jinping also reiterates, China will never follow the path of colonization or a path of seeking hegemony when a country becomes more powerful. Tell us more of that. Many people say, oh, that's a Chinese slogan, that's just empty. But tell us a little more about that.
Well, this is not only philosophical and political and geopolitical, but it's also very pragmatic, because China does not want to become a so-called superpower or a power which is eager to impose its version of the truth onto others. China believes everyone is equal, and China is perfectly happy to get along with all countries with different systems, different ways of lives, different values, so as to make the world more diversified.
With that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qianduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.